She was always there, until the day she wasn't, and only then did he understand what silence truly sounds like. The first thing Jane heard every time was her own footsteps. Heels on marble, a clean, deliberate sound, each step announcing something she had never intended to announce. I am here. I arrived. I am still arriving. The grand reception hall of the Willard Hotel swallowed that sound within 2 strides, absorbed it into the deeper noise of 200 people performing their best versions of themselves, and Jane would straighten her spine and let the room take her in. Washington City in the autumn of 1868 smelled of coal smoke and ambition, and the particular desperation of a nation trying to remember what it had been before it tore itself apart. The war had been over 3 years. The wounds had not. They lived in the faces of the men who filled rooms like this one, men who had commanded armies and now commanded political allegiances, who had learned to fight in fields of mud and now fought in parlors of marble, with words as their weapons and influence as their ammunition. Tonight was the 3rd Autumn Officers' Ball. Jane paused at the entrance for only a moment, barely a breath, and smoothed the front of her midnight blue silk gown with the flat of her palm. Not nervousness, a habit. She had made that distinction so many times inside her own head that it had worn a groove the way water wears a groove in stone. Eventually you stop questioning the groove and simply follow it. The hall smelled of beeswax candles and hothouse flowers, arranged in extravagant abundance, and the hair pomade of men who had spent the afternoon preparing for exactly this, the performance of power in peacetime, which required, she had learned, considerably more costuming than war. She recognized most of the faces. By the 2nd year of attending these events, she had memorized them. By the 3rd, she could anticipate the first thing each of them would say to her, always some variation of the same sentence, always centering on him. You must be so proud of the general. He's extraordinary, isn't he? What he did at Petersburg. How does it feel, Mrs. Carrington, to be married to the most celebrated officer of his generation? She always smiled. She always answered graciously. She had, over the course of 3 years of these evenings, become extraordinarily skilled at gracious. It had started as an effort. Somewhere in the 2nd year, it had become reflex. She wasn't sure which was worse. What she had not become skilled at, what she suspected she would never become skilled at, no matter how many balls she attended, no matter how many crystal glasses she held with steady hands, was the moment she would turn to find Octavian's face in a crowded room and find it already pointing somewhere else. He was across the hall. General Octavian Carrington stood at the center of a cluster of men who orbited him with the quiet reverence of people who understand where the gravity is. He was tall in the way that certain men are tall, not just height, but mass, presence, the particular way his body took up space as though the air had agreed long ago to arrange itself around him. His dress uniform, dark blue wool with the gold epaulettes of his rank, was immaculate. His jaw was set. His expression was the one she thought of privately as his public face, controlled, attentive, constructed to reveal nothing that hadn't been cleared for release. He had worn that same expression through 4 years of war. He wore it now, as though the war had simply changed rooms. His dark eyes moved through the hall with the patience of a man who has spent 20 years reading terrain before committing to a step. They found hers. A breath, maybe 2, then they moved on. Jane breathed in slowly, through her nose all the way down, settling the breath beneath her ribs in the place where she kept the things she refused to name, and crossed into the room. She accepted a glass of punch from a white-gloved attendant. She laughed at something a congressman said that wasn't particularly funny. She admired Colonel Harwick's wife's cameo brooch and meant it, because it was genuinely lovely, and Jane had never seen the point of insincere compliments. They exhausted everyone involved. She was, by every visible and external measure, a woman who was perfectly fine. She was not, in any measure that actually mattered, perfectly fine. It had begun at the first ball. 3 years ago in this same room, she had walked in on Octavian's arm and felt, briefly, with the reckless optimism of someone who had not yet learned to protect themselves from it, like a woman in a story going somewhere worth going. He had looked at her differently then, or she had perceived him differently. She was no longer certain which, and she had spent enough time turning the question over that she'd grown cautious of it. He had looked at her with something that lived just beneath his careful expression, something she had been young enough and hopeful enough to call tenderness. Then the Secretary of War's wife had approached, a broad, formidable woman named Helena Marsh, whose husband held the most powerful civilian position in Washington's military establishment, whose opinion lived solidly in the category of professionally significant. And Octavian had shifted, not dramatically, just slightly forward, the smallest possible repositioning of his body, and had introduced Jane as an acquaintance of the family, not his wife, an acquaintance. Jane had stood at the edge of their conversation for 23 minutes. She had held her punch glass and said the appropriate things when included, and smiled when smiled at, and learned, for the first time, what it felt like to be made invisible inside a room full of candlelight. She had noted the feeling carefully, the way she noted structural damage in the old plantation houses she worked to restore, the location, the depth, the likely cause, an assessment of whether it could be repaired or whether it had already reached the foundation. She had assumed it was a mistake. She had assumed wrong. It happened at every event. Not with cruelty, not with anything she could point to and name cleanly. Octavian never ignored her. He checked on her with the attentiveness of a man fulfilling a scheduled obligation. Regular, punctual, affectless. He walked in with her when protocol required it. He was never unkind. But the moment anyone whose opinion shaped his world entered the radius of their conversation, Jane was erased. Quietly, efficiently, without drama. An acquaintance, a family friend. Sometimes just Jane, her first name offered without context, floating unanchored, available for whatever assumption the listener wanted to make. Once, at the congressional reception in December, the second year, a young aide had asked directly, "And who is this?" Octavian had paused. Not long. A fraction, but Jane felt that fraction in her chest the way you feel the first hairline crack in ice beneath your feet. Not painful yet, but definitive. The sound of something that was never going to be the same. A family friend, he had said. She had held her glass very, very steady after that. She had held it the way you hold on to the only honest thing in the room. Tonight she set it down at 9:15. Excused herself from a conversation mid-sentence, graciously, warmly, no trace of anything, retrieved her evening wrap from the cloakroom attendant, walked out through the tall brass doors into the cold October night, and stepped into the carriage she had quietly arranged 3 days earlier. She did not tell Octavian she was leaving. She did not look back to see if he noticed. She kept her eyes forward the entire ride home, watching the gas lamps of Pennsylvania Avenue pass in amber succession. Other windows, other lives, the ordinary machinery of a city rebuilding itself. And she did not cry, which surprised her, because she had expected to. Instead, she just felt very tired, the specific tiredness of someone who has been standing upright through something for a long time and has finally, with great care, set it down. He noticed at 9:18, it was not a sound, not a movement. It was the absence of a specific kind of weight, the particular density that Jane brought to any room she occupied, something he had never been able to explain technically and had stopped trying. And Octavian felt it disappear the way you feel a window close on an autumn evening. Suddenly, without announcement, the air changed. He turned. The east side of the hall, near the tall windows, empty. Her punch glass sat on a side table, still half full, the faint impression of her lips on the rim. He looked at it for longer than made any tactical sense. He excused himself from Aldrich mid-sentence. He moved through the hall the way he always moved, with the efficient stride his officers had recognized through 4 years of campaigns as purposeful, the general in motion, and checked the adjacent sitting room, the terrace, the wide corridor near the entrance. The cloakroom attendant confirmed it. Midnight blue silk gown, 10 minutes ago. A carriage had been called for her. Octavian stood in the entrance of the Willard and held the specific temperature of those words. Not impulsive, not reactive. She had planned this. She had decided in advance, sometime before tonight, had arranged the carriage, set the contingency, and had come anyway. Had stood in that room for 2 hours and drunk her punch, and smiled at the right faces and said nothing to him. And then she had left. He went back to Aldrich. He stayed until midnight. He said the right things to the right people, shook the right hands, maintained the right expression at the right moments. He was, by every measure available to the room, completely fine. He did not sleep when he got home. Her door was closed. The light beneath it was off. He stood in the corridor outside it for a long moment, hand not quite raised to knock, not quite withdrawn to his side, suspended in the specific paralysis of a man who knows what he should do and cannot bring himself to do it. Then he walked to his study and sat in the dark with a glass of bourbon he didn't touch until the sky outside the window began, almost imperceptibly, to change color. He sat there thinking about the glass on the side table, the half-full punch and the impression of her lips, and the fact that she had been there and now she wasn't, and that the room, that entire large, glittering, important room, had noticed her absence in exactly 0 ways, because no one in that room had been watching for her. No one had been counting. He had been counting. That, he thought, was the beginning of the problem. She was already at the table when he came downstairs, dressed, hair pinned in the simple, precise way she preferred, when she wasn't performing anything for anyone. A book open in front of her, not the one she'd been reading last week, a new one, which meant she had gone to the shelf at some point during the night or very early this morning, which meant she also had not slept well, and she had still managed to be downstairs before him, composed and arranged, because Jane did not allow herself to be caught undone. He registered all of this in the 2 seconds it took him to cross to the sideboard, where the morning coffee waited. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he poured. He stood at the window. The kitchen light was the pale gold of early November mornings in Washington, the kind of light that made everything look briefly forgivable, and he looked at the bare oak in the yard instead of at her. "You left early last night," he said. "I was tired." "You didn't say anything." She turned a page. "You were busy." The 2 sentences dropped into the space between them like stones into deep water. They barely made a sound. They sank immediately. Octavian set down his cup. "There is a reception next Friday," he said. "At the War Department. Secretary Rawlins will be present. It is significant." She looked up. Her eyes, that grey-green, still water color, the color he associated with a kind of intelligence that never needed to raise its voice, held his for a moment. "I know," she said. "I would like you to attend." Something moved through her expression. It was small, a barely perceptible tightening at the corners of her mouth, the kind that only exists for a quarter of a second before the person wearing it reasserts control. And then it was gone, managed back behind the composure she had built so carefully over 3 years. "Of course," she said. She stood. She carried her coffee cup to the sideboard and set it down without turning around. "I will be ready at 7. She left. Octavian stood in the morning room alone, his own coffee going cold in his hand, and tried to identify the precise moment when the distance between himself and the woman in the next room had become too wide to simply step across. He couldn't find it. That was the thing. There had been no single moment, no incident he could isolate and examine and correct. It had accumulated, ball by ball, introduction by introduction, silence by silence, the way structural damage accumulates in a house that isn't maintained, invisibly, until the day you look up and realize the ceiling has been compromised for years and you simply hadn't looked up. He finished his cold coffee. He set down the cup. He went to his study and sat down at his desk and stared at the locked drawer in the lower left corner for a long time before he stood up, put on his coat, and rode to the War Department. It happened 6 weeks before Jane stopped coming. Octavian had been leaving a strategy briefing on the upper floor of the War Department building, the kind of meeting that fills 2 hours and produces half a page of actionable orders, when he turned the corner of the east corridor and stopped. Reyes was already stopped, as if he'd been waiting. 2 feet of corridor between them. The kind of distance that is technically polite and functionally confrontational. The distance of 2 men who know each other well enough to understand that proximity, in certain conversations, is its own form of statement. General Armand Reyes, formerly of the Confederate Army, now a man carefully threading his way through the politics of Reconstruction, attending the right dinners and speaking the right sympathies, was older now. They both were. But he carried his age the way certain men carry expensive things, with the ease of someone who expects to keep carrying them. His hair had gone silver at the temples. His posture was the posture of a man who had surrendered a war without surrendering anything else. "Carrington," he said. Pleasant, unhurried. Reyes. A pause. The particular quality of pause that belongs to 2 people whose history isn't summarized in corridors. "Your wife was lovely at the ball last month," Reyes said. Casual. "The way you mention weather you've noticed and found unremarkable. Jane, isn't it? The preservationist." The temperature in Octavian's chest dropped several degrees. Reyes knew her name. Not your wife, not Mrs. Carrington. Jane. Her first name offered with the specific ease of someone who has been holding it for a while and is now choosing deliberately to let it go. He knew her work. He had identified the specific project, the Hargrove Plantation restoration, the most discussed preservation effort in Virginia, the one Jane's name was most publicly attached to. He had been watching, not since last month, for some time before that, long enough to gather the kind of specific detail that has only one purpose. "She is," Octavian said. 2 words. Nothing added. Reyes smiled. The smile that shows the card without showing the card. "The Hargrove work is remarkable from what I hear. She must be extraordinary to take on a project of that scope. A half-beat. It takes a rare kind of woman to find beauty in what the war left behind. A rare kind of woman. The sentence sat in the corridor like a thing that had decided to stay. Octavian held his gaze for a long moment, long enough to be deliberate, not long enough to be a response. "Excuse me," he said. He walked past. He did not slow, he did not look back. He descended the staircase and walked out into the grey November afternoon and stood on the steps of the War Department for a moment before his aide brought his horse. That evening, in his study, he went through every account published in the Washington papers from the past 18 months, every illustration, every mention, every social column that had placed Jane at his side. In 11 of them, she was clearly identifiable, clearly present, clearly connected to him, clearly the person a careful and experienced man might file under point of access. He had spent 20 years making himself unreadable. He had done it well. The men who had tried to reach him through military channels had found stone walls. The ones who had tried through personal ones had found the same. He had kept his private life spare, deliberate, nothing attached that could be used except Jane. He had loved her quietly and privately, and without any plan, in the way that happens to people before they realize it's happening, and that had told a patient man everything he needed. Octavian thought about Reyes's position, a former Confederate general navigating Reconstruction, a man with old alliances, old grievances, and the patience of someone who has learned to fight through channels that don't appear in any official record. He thought about their history, 3 specific moments during the war at which Octavian's decisions had directly dismantled operations Reyes had staked his reputation on, not carelessly, because certain things cannot be preserved when the cost of preserving them is other people's lives. Reyes knew this. He had known it at the time. He had never forgiven it. He thought about Jane's name in that corridor, offered like a card placed face up on the table. "I know about her, I know who she is, I know what she means to you." He closed the newspaper. He went to Jane's door. He stood outside it with his hand almost touching the wood and listened. Habit, the oldest habit, for the sound of her lamp. He heard it click off, that small, clean sound in the quiet house, and stood there in the dark corridor with something pressing very hard against the inside of his chest. Then he walked back down the hall. He sat in his study. He made a plan. He made it the way he made every plan, alone, without consulting anyone, with the focused efficiency of a man who has learned to separate what he wants from what the situation permits. What he wanted, Jane, present fully in every room of his life. What the situation permitted, the opposite. He would not give Reyes a target. He would make Jane appear peripheral, unimportant, the kind of wife kept out of social obligation rather than love, unremarkable, unattached in any visible way, a family friend, an acquaintance, a woman whose name he offered without warmth, because warmth was the tell. Warmth was the thing that said, "Here, this one, this is where you press." He had been doing it already, somewhat instinctively since that first ball when Helena Marsh had approached, and he had felt, with sudden cold clarity, the exposure of it, how visible it was, what he felt when Jane was in the room. He had been doing it without naming it. Now he would do it deliberately. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself he would explain everything when it was resolved. He told himself Jane was strong. She was. She was the most quietly strong person he knew, and she would understand when he could finally tell her. He did not examine that night what finally meant, or how long the space between the decision and the explanation would actually stretch. He did not consider what it would cost her to live inside that space. He would consider it later, riding back from a state dinner with an empty seat in the carriage beside him, and it would be far too late for the consideration to be cheap. She wore burgundy to the War Department reception. He hadn't anticipated it. In all the events before this one, she had defaulted to blues and greens, cool colors, composed colors, the palette of a woman who had decided, consciously or not, to blend into rooms where she'd been made to feel optional. The burgundy said something different, not loudly, not with any announcement. The color of garnets, of autumn leaves past their peak, of a woman who had stopped choosing her wardrobe for the room's benefit. Octavian saw her at the top of the staircase and felt something in his chest shift, slow, tectonic, entirely without warning. She descended with the unhurried ease of a woman who had stopped performing her arrival for anyone's benefit. At the bottom step, her eyes met his, and he saw it immediately. The distance, her own now. Something she had been growing quietly, the way quiet things grow, without announcement, with patience, in the spaces no one was watching. "You look, we should go." A beat. The carriage is waiting. She moved past him. He caught her perfume. Rose water and something warm underneath, a scent so entirely hers that, encountering it unexpectedly in other rooms of the house, had become, over these years, a specific and complicated problem, and followed her down the front steps. The ride was 11 minutes through the lamplit streets. Jane looked out the carriage window for the first 7 minutes, then at her gloved hands folded in her lap, then forward, at nothing in particular. She did not look at him. He looked at the street. The reception was held in the formal hall of the War Department building. Marble floors, tall windows looking out over the mall, the Potomac visible in the distance under the last light. The most significant gathering of the season. Every conversation in that room was, beneath its pleasant surface, about something being decided. Land, money, political appointments, the slow, contested business of what the South would become. Senator Aldrich intercepted them within the first 3 minutes. "General Carrington, good to see you." Handshake, then turning. "And my wife," Octavian said. He said it before anything else happened, before the practiced sequence. Assess, weigh, manage the exposure. The words pushed through all of that, carried by something that had apparently been waiting considerably longer than he understood. Beside him, Jane went very still. Not obviously, not in any way the room would register, but he was standing close enough to feel the precise change in the quality of her stillness, poised for one outcome, receiving another, her whole bearing quietly taking inventory. "Mrs. Carrington, Octavian mentioned your work on the Hargrove restoration." Senator Aldrich smiled with genuine warmth. "Remarkable undertaking. The East Wing, the original woodwork. I heard you made extraordinary decisions about what to preserve." And Jane talked, not the measured diplomatic version of herself she had been carrying into these rooms like a tool, the real one, the one that had specific and informed opinions about what was worth saving and how to save it, about the particular challenge of honoring what something had been while allowing it to become what it needed to be. She talked with her hands moving slightly in the air between her and the senator, which she only did when she had forgotten to be careful, when the conversation was real enough that she'd stopped monitoring herself. Octavian stood 2 feet away and watched it happen with something that sat exactly between relief and devastation. He had told Aldrich about the Hargrove project, months ago in what he'd allowed to read as passing conversation, except it hadn't been passing. He had mentioned it because he'd been asked what Jane occupied herself with, and had found, when he opened his mouth, that he knew quite a lot about the Hargrove restoration because he had listened. In the evenings when she came home with dust on her skirts and frustration in her eyes about a contractor who didn't understand what preserve meant. He had listened to all of it, across 3 years of private evenings, and a marriage that had been in its quiet spaces considerably more present than its public face suggested. She hadn't known he'd been listening. She understood it now. He watched the understanding move through her, a slight shift in her expression, the careful weighing of what it meant that he had spoken about her work, that he had remembered it, that he had offered it to someone else as something worth knowing. Her voice didn't change. She kept talking to Aldrich, but he felt her become, in some small and significant way, less certain of the story she'd been telling herself about him. Across the room, near the east windows, Reyes stood with a glass of bourbon and his pleasant expression that never touched his eyes. He watched them for several minutes. Octavian felt the attention without meeting it, the specific pressure of a practiced observer, the kind of attention that is itself a form of pressure. He kept his focus on Jane, on the conversation, on the brightness in her face when Aldrich asked something she found genuinely interesting, and she leaned forward slightly, the way she always did when a problem engaged her. When Octavian finally glanced toward the east windows, Reyes was setting down his glass, not retreating, updating, a man reassessing the situation, finding the variables changed in ways that alter the original approach. The point of access he had identified was no longer hidden. You cannot use against a man what he has already openly claimed. Reyes left 30 minutes before the event ended. Octavian did not watch him go. He was watching Jane. She didn't come to the Congressional State Dinner. Octavian had knocked on her door at 6:45. The room was empty. Not just unoccupied, but deliberately empty. The specific emptiness of a room whose occupant has made a considered choice. The dark green dress she had laid out the night before was gone. A note sat folded on the vanity table, without his name on it. She had not addressed it to him. That omission was its own sentence. Octavian, I'm sorry. I cannot do this tonight. J. He stood in her room for longer than made sense. It still held her. Rosewater and warmth, the books arranged with the mild, honest disorder of someone who reads in earnest rather than for appearance. The small watercolor above the dressing mirror of a plantation house mid-restoration. Columns stripped back to bare wood, waiting. He had never asked her which house it was. He had been careful not to accumulate details that would be too costly to carry. That carefulness, he now understood, had been its own kind of damage. He went alone. He sat in his assigned seat at the long congressional table and performed the dinner with the focused excellence of a man who has made excellence into muscle memory. He answered the general to his left about troop deployment in the South. He made the senator to his right laugh twice. He ate and drank in appropriate measure and maintained the expression of a man who was exactly where he intended to be. He looked at Jane's empty chair 3 times. The first time was instinct. The second time was hope, which he recognized and did not forgive himself for. The third time was just grief. Plain, unheroic, entirely his own making. Reyes was 2 seats down the table. Octavian felt his attention before he registered it consciously. The particular weight of a man watching without appearing to. When Octavian looked at the empty chair the third time, Reyes followed the look. The smile was small, satisfied. The smile of a man who has confirmed that the pressure point produces exactly the result he predicted. Octavian looked away. In the space between looking away and returning his attention to the senator beside him, less than 2 seconds in real time, considerably longer inside his chest, something became clear with the particular brutality of things that have been true for a long time before the mind agrees to face them directly. He had made a plan to protect Jane from a threat she didn't know existed. The plan had required him to hurt her slowly and consistently for nearly 2 years. He had told himself that was the cost of keeping her safe. He had not, until this moment, in this marble hall with her empty chair beside him, fully accepted that the person most damaged by his plan was the exact person the plan was meant to protect. The dinner continued. He stayed until the end. He rode home in the carriage with the posture of a man who has not just arrived at a conclusion that changes everything. In the carriage, alone, with the gas lamps of Pennsylvania Avenue passing in amber succession outside the window, he let himself feel it. He didn't give it long. He was not a man who gave grief long, but he gave it 2 minutes, which for him was considerable. Then he told the driver to take him home. He came home at 11. He bypassed the study, bypassed the bourbon, walked directly to her door and knocked before he had fully decided to, the knock arriving ahead of the decision, the same way my wife had arrived ahead of the strategy at the War Department reception, the same way every honest thing still left in him now moved, faster than the part of him trained to manage it. Silence, the specific quality of silence that means someone is present and deciding. Come in. She was in the chair by the window, a shawl around her shoulders against the November cold, a book closed in her lap. She had not been reading. The oil lamp at her side cast a warm circle that made the rest of the room fall back into shadow. She looked at him without expression, not cold, not sharp with anger, with something more depleting than either, the careful, settled stillness of a woman who has stopped expecting. He crossed the room. He did not sit. There was nowhere to sit in this room that didn't require a decision, and stood at the edge of the lamplight, close enough that looking away from him would have required a deliberate choice. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The house was very quiet. Outside, the distant clatter of a late carriage on the cobblestones. Inside, just the hiss of the lamp and the particular silence of 2 people who have shared the same space for too long without actually sharing it. I didn't come tonight, she said. I know. I thought... She stopped, looked down at the closed book in her lap, then back up with the expression of someone who had prepared something to say and found in the moment that the prepared version wasn't the honest one. I thought if I stopped coming it would get easier, like the pattern would just become official, something I could carry differently. Did it? No. Quiet, unheld, entirely true. Not even a little. He looked at her, the way she was sitting, upright, composed, the posture of a woman who had been holding herself up alone for so long that it had stopped feeling like effort and started feeling like the shape of things. There is something I need to tell you, he said. She waited. That was Jane. She had always known when to wait. She sat with the patience of someone who is present and listening and will not rush you, but will not let you off either. He told her about Reyes, not with the clean precision of a military briefing. He didn't have that in him tonight, and she deserved the version he actually had. He told it the way things come out when they've been held too long, unevenly, one detail arriving before its context. One sentence walked back and restarted. He told her about the corridor at the War Department, the specific cold of hearing her name offered in that voice, with that ease. Jane, isn't it? As though she were already catalogued, already filed. He told her about going through the newspaper illustrations afterward, the slow-building conclusion that the vulnerability wasn't in his military record or his political standing, it was in his own house. It was the woman who arrived early to every event to learn the room before the room learned her. It was the way he looked at her when he forgot to look away. He told her what he had decided, and why. And then, the part that cost him most to say aloud, because saying it aloud required fully looking at it, he told her what it had cost her, what he had understood tonight, sitting in that congressional hall with her empty chair beside him, and Reyes's satisfied smile 2 seats away. She was completely still through all of it. When he finished, the room held the kind of quiet that has weight. Then she said, "You were protecting me." "Yes." "From a man I had never heard of?" "Yes." "By making me feel—" She stopped. Her jaw tightened. She breathed in once, deliberately. "Octavian, do you understand what I believed? For 2 years." She wasn't performing the question. She was asking it. "I thought you were ashamed of me. I thought I was something that had made sense at one time but didn't fit the life you had actually built. I thought—" A short, involuntary exhale, not quite a laugh, something tireder than that. "I thought family friend was you being kind about it. I thought acquaintance was you being honest." Something in Octavian's chest took the words and did not move past them. "No," he said. The word came out stripped of everything else. "Jane, never." "I know that now." She shook her head, not dismissing him, working through it the way Jane worked through everything, directly, without performance. "I'm not saying you don't. I can see that you—" She stopped, frustrated with her own sentence in a way he had never seen from her before. Usually Jane arrived at words pre-assembled. The fumbling undid him more than any polished speech could have. "I'm saying I didn't know it then, and the not knowing had a texture to it. Every ball, every introduction, every time you said my name like it was a footnote in someone else's story." She looked at him directly. "That doesn't just fade. It settles somewhere in you. I know it does. Do you, though?" The question sat between them. Not unkind, just honest. The kind of question that asks to be answered, not managed. "I made decisions about your life without you," he said. "I told myself it was protection. It was also, I did not want you to carry the weight of the threat. I thought I could hold it alone, and you would never need to know." He paused. "I did not understand that I had handed you a different weight instead, a heavier one. You built a wall around me," she said quietly, "and did not tell me I was inside it." "Yes, and I built a wall around myself to survive being inside yours." He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly what happened." She stood up, not dramatically, just stood, crossed the short distance between them, and stopped in front of him, close enough that the lamplight held them both, close enough that he could see the precise color of her eyes, the faint evidence of a long night held together by will, the small muscle at her jaw that had been working since he started talking. Her hand came up slowly, palm flat against the front of his uniform coat. Not an embrace, a question. The oldest kind. "Are you here?" Actually here this time, without the plan running underneath it. His heartbeat was the only honest answer he had. She felt it. He watched it move through her, the slight settling around her eyes, the one full breath she allowed herself without bracing for its consequence. She stood like that for a long moment, hand on his chest, listening to something that needed no translation across the darkness of what the last 2 years had been. "If I stay," she said very quietly, "I need you to stop making plans that include me without including me. Yes, whatever the danger is, I want to know it." Her eyes held his steadily. "I am not a detail you protect from the full picture. I am the full picture." The last sentence arrived in Octavian's chest and stayed. "Yes," he said, "you are." He brought his hand up and covered hers, carefully, with the deliberateness of someone who understands that some gestures cannot be walked back, and they stood in the circle of lamplight while the November wind moved through the eaves of the house, and the city continued its indifferent business outside, and the room held them in the particular quiet of 2 people who have finally said the true thing. It was not full resolution. Trust rebuilt differently from trust first given. Jane would tell him that in the days after, plainly and without cruelty, and she was right. He did not ask for more than she had available to offer, but her hand was on his chest, and he was holding it. And for the first time in longer than either of them could cleanly name, there was nothing between them in the dark. She came to the next event, a reception at Senator Aldrich's home. Nothing ceremonial, A Thursday evening gathering over port and conversation, the kind that shapes decisions without ever acknowledging it is doing so. She wore dark green wool, simply cut, with her mother's garnet pin at her collar. She arrived composed and slightly early, because Jane was always early, because she needed to know a room before the room knew her, and that hadn't changed, wouldn't change, was not a wound to be healed, but simply her, and Octavian had finally stopped filing it under things that required his management. She was at the window when he found her, the same habit, the same slight tilt of her chin as she oriented herself, read the room's arrangements and faces, and the particular social geometry of who was standing nearest to whom. He watched her for a moment from across the room before he moved. She turned before he reached her. She had always been able to hear his footsteps specifically, in a room full of footsteps. He had understood that for some time now, and he had stopped making himself small about the understanding. Congressman Galloway intercepted them 2 minutes in. General Carrington, handshake, a turn toward Jane. And Octavian looked at Jane first. 1 second, just to look at her before he answered. My wife Jane. She leads the preservation work on the Hargrove estate, the most significant restoration effort in Virginia since the war ended. She is the reason that house will stand another 100 years, rather than becoming a ruin. Galloway recalibrated visibly. A man who had expected a name and received an endorsement, delivered with the quiet force of absolute conviction. Mrs. Carrington, I've heard remarkable things about Hargrove. The decisions about what to restore and what to let go, I imagine that requires an extraordinary kind of judgment, Jane answered, naturally, fluently, with the quiet authority of someone who doesn't need volume to occupy space. Her hands moved slightly. She only did that when she had forgotten to perform composure, when the conversation was real enough that she'd stopped monitoring herself. Octavian stood at her side, shoulder nearly at her shoulder, present without commentary, and listened to her the way he had been listening to her in the private evenings of their life for 3 years. The difference was that now the room could see it. He felt her awareness of that, the small recalibration in her posture. Not defensive, not surprised, but steady. This is real. He is not going to pull it back. She didn't pull back either. Across the room near the fireplace, Reyes stood with his bourbon. He watched them for several minutes. Octavian felt the attention without meeting it, the particular pressure of being observed by someone who is updating an assessment. He kept his focus on Jane, on the conversation, on the brightness in her expression when Galloway asked something she hadn't been asked before, and she leaned forward slightly, the way she always did when a problem genuinely interested her. When he finally glanced toward the fireplace, Reyes was already turning away. Not retreating, updating. A man who has assessed the variables and found them changed in ways that make the original approach unworkable. The point of access he had identified was no longer hidden, no longer available as a lever. You cannot use against a man what he has already openly claimed. Reyes set down his glass, said something to the man beside him, left early, as men do when the room has stopped being useful to them. Octavian did not watch him go. He was watching Jane, fully here, fully herself, explaining to a congressman who had started the conversation with polite social obligation and was now leaning forward with something that looked unmistakably like genuine interest, and felt in every armored and guarded and careful part of himself the irreversible weight of understanding what he had nearly lost by protecting it in the wrong direction. She still arrived early. She always would. Some things don't change when a marriage repairs itself. They don't need to. Jane arrived early because Jane needed to know a room before the room knew her. Not a wound, not a symptom of the years of managed distance. Just her, the same as it had always been her. And Octavian had finally stopped confusing the two. What was different? He arrived early too. Not because military protocol required it, not because any social obligation said so, because Jane was there, and the room she was learning was the room he was walking into, and standing in it before it filled, before the ambition and the performance and the careful posturing that Washington ran on crowded out everything honest, felt like the most natural place in the world to be. He found her at the 4th Autumn Officers' Ball, standing at the east window, the same window, the one where her half-full punch glass had sat 2 years ago while he stood across the room and let those counted seconds pass and then looked away. She was looking out at the October dark, the lamplit streets below, the Capitol dome visible through the glass, the slow and imperfect business of a nation trying to put itself back together. She turned when she heard him. Not startled. She had heard his specific footsteps in a room of footsteps. He had understood that for some time now, and he had stopped making himself small around the understanding. "You're early," she said. "You're always early. That's different. I have reasons. I know your reasons." He stopped beside her at the window. "Know the room before the room knows you." She looked at him, the small, slightly crooked smile, not the gracious mask she had worn for 3 years like armor, but the real one, the one that had always been kept for him in the private spaces that their public life had never been allowed to touch. "You've been paying attention," she said. "For longer than you knew," he said. She turned back to the window. He stood beside her while the hall filled behind them, the rhythmic sounds, the scent of beeswax and pomade and ambition, 200 people performing their finest roles for one another. Everything was the same as it had always been. The room was unchanged. The people in it were unchanged. But the two of them, they were different. "Last year," she said after a moment. "After the first ball where you actually—" She paused. She chose the word carefully, the way she chose everything. "Where you introduced me properly. I went home and sat on the edge of the bed for a very long time." He looked at her. "Not crying," she said. "Just sitting. Because I had spent so long building a version of myself that could be fine without being seen. That structure was solid, Octavian. I had really built it, brick by brick across 2 years of these rooms. And then you just—" A small exhale. The sound of something releasing that had been held a long time. "It is harder than it sounds. Being seen again, after you have learned how to be invisible." "I know," he said. "I am sorry it took so long. I am not asking for an apology." She glanced at him sideways. "I am telling you it was hard, so you know, so there are no more things between us that one of us carries and the other doesn't." He looked at her for a long moment, at the specific way she said it, without accusation, without the sharpened edges of a grievance being maintained, just the plain, quiet commitment to no more dark spaces, no more plans made alone in studies in the middle of the night, no more walls built around a person without telling that person they were inside one. "Thank you," he said, "for telling me." She looked at him. Something moved through her expression, not the controlled, diplomatic movement of a woman managing her reaction, but something slower and truer, the kind of thing that surfaces only when a person has finally stopped bracing for the worst. "I almost didn't come back," she said. "After that last dinner, the one I didn't attend." She said it quietly, as a fact rather than a wound, but it landed with the full weight of what it was. "I had started to think about what it would mean to stop coming altogether, not just to the events, to all of it." The words sat in the air between them. Outside, a carriage passed on the cobblestones below. Somewhere in the hall behind them, a woman laughed at something. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind that rang out before the person producing it could think to soften it. "I know," Octavian said. "Do you?" "Yes." He did not look away from her. "I saw it in the note. Not the words, the way you wrote it. You had already made a decision, and then unmade it." The pen hesitated. He paused. "I know your handwriting." She was quiet for a moment. "You know my handwriting," she repeated, not a question. Something softer than that, the quiet, complicated acknowledgement of a woman who has just been given proof of being known by someone she had half convinced herself did not see her. "I have read every letter you have ever sent me," he said. "From the first one, when things were still simple. I have kept all of them." She turned to look at him fully then. "Why?" she asked. Not with challenge, with genuine and unguarded curiosity, the kind of question that can only be asked when the armor has come off enough to risk the answer. "Because they sound like you," he said. "The real version. The one that doesn't smooth things over for the benefit of the room." The hall behind them was filling completely now. The string quartet was tuning, the brief, discordant sound of instruments finding their common pitch before the music could begin. A sound that had always struck Jane, she had once told him on a quiet evening years ago, as the most honest moment of any performance, the part before the performance, when everything was still finding its way. He had remembered that too. "There is one more thing," he said, "that I want to say. Before the music starts and we go back in there and I have to be the other version of myself." She waited. "I am not going to be perfect at this," he said, "at being present, at letting people see what you are to me. I have spent 20 years learning to keep everything close. That does not undo quickly." He held her gaze. "But I want you to know that every time I fail at it, every time I fall back into old patterns, it is not because you don't matter. It will be because I am still learning how to stop protecting things by hiding them." A pause. "I want you to tell me when it happens. Not to spare my feelings. Tell me plainly." Jane looked at him for a long moment, then the slightly crooked smile again. Small, real, the one that was not for the room. "That," she said, "is the most honest thing you have ever said to me. I am aware he said. "It is uncomfortable," she laughed. Briefly, genuinely, not the polished social laugh she produced in rooms like this one, but the real one, the one that arrived slightly ahead of her composure and didn't apologize for it. He had not heard it in a long time. It landed somewhere in his chest and stayed. The quartet found its first note. The music began. He turned to her. She had already set her punch glass on the wide window ledge. She took his hand. He held it the way he held it now, not with the formal correctness of a man fulfilling a social obligation, not with the careful restraint of a man managing an exposure, but with the particular steadiness of someone who understands what he is holding and has stopped pretending otherwise, her gloved fingers against his, the simple, irreducible fact of it. They walked out onto the floor. Behind them, the east window held the October dark and the lamplit street below and the Capitol dome patient and pale against the sky, that imperfect, ongoing, unfinished monument to a nation still deciding what it was going to be. The ledge where a punch glass had been set down, not in preparation for a quiet departure this time, but simply because her hands had somewhere better to be. Ahead, the room, the music, the 200 people who could see them now, who had been permitted, finally, to see them, and who would say later, to anyone who asked, that General Carrington and his wife moved through that hall the way people move when they are not performing anything, just present, just together, just themselves. Jane Sterling, who had learned every angle of every room she had ever been made to feel optional in. Octavian Carrington, who had spent 2 years making her disappear to protect her, and had very nearly lost her to the dark of it instead. And between the beginning and now, the half-full glasses and the empty chairs and the notes without names and the lamplight conversation that changed everything, all of it folded quietly into the past, where it would stay, carried but not worn, known but not carried in front. Washington City moved on around them, the way cities do, imperfect, ambitious, wounded, rebuilding, always in the middle of becoming something it had not yet decided to be. The music played. They danced. If this story moved you, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. See you there.
I learned to hold a glass so steady. I learned to smile before the pain. I turned to find your eyes in every room and watch them turn away again. 3 years of being called a family friend. 3 years of counting to the 3. The seconds that your eyes would find me before you chose the room over me. I didn't ask for grand gestures. I didn't ask for anything at all. I only asked to exist beside you. Instead I learned the shape of a wall. Say my name in the light, not in the dark where no one hears. Say my name in the room, let the right people know I'm here. I am not a secret to protect. I am not a risk you calculate. I am your wife. Say it before it's too late. You thought you were keeping me safe, but safe is not the same as seen. You built a wall around my life and never told me what it means. I held my glass so steadily, I smiled like I was made of stone. You were protecting me from him while I was just so alone. Say my name in the light, not in the dark where no one hears. Say my name in the room. Say it like you mean it, like you have for years. I am not a secret to protect. I am not a risk you calculate. I am your wife, and it's not too late. She took his hand. The chandelier cast light on everything, and this time